is the information of geographical information systems. He specializes in the effects of anthropogenic presence on natural environment and climate. Dr. Salman, please. Professor Ilhan Niaz is a professor of history at Quaid-e-Azam University. He discusses climate change in his latest book, Downfall: Lessons from Our Final Century. Now, Dr. Imran Khalid is the Director of Policy and Governance at WWF. He is also a Fulbright Scholar and has served at SDPI previously. Thank you, Dr. Imran. Dr. Bashir Ahmed is the Director of Climate, Energy, and Water Resources Institute at the National Agricultural Research Center. Dr. Bashir, please. And last but not least, Ms. Maheen Zara is a social protection specialist at the Oxford Policy Management Institute, and she is an alumna of the University of Oxford and NYU. And she's also one of the best teachers I've ever had, so please welcome her on stage. All right, so the theme academia in climate resilience and sustainable development is sort of a continuous question that has existed in my mind ever since I joined NUST and its Office of Sustainability. This is the question with which the Office of Sustainability developed its sustainability strategy. This is the question that led us to develop a panel of experts in climate change at NUST, who then developed the NUST Integrated Climate Resilient Policy and Action Plan, which is going to be launched tomorrow, by the way. What is academia's responsibility in climate resilience and sustainable development? What gaps can we fill up with research? And for my first question, I would like to address it to Dr. Bashir. We're hearing a lot about climate smart agriculture, and we know that food is going to be an issue for us with the climate crisis. What innovations do we have in the realm of food and climate that can help Pakistan lessen our food insecurity in the future?
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, NUST, for providing this opportunity. Yes, Pakistan Agriculture Research Council, as well as our institute, that is Climate, Energy and Water Resources, we have been working from last few years on climate change. Climate change studies, we started develop first time the inventory of glacier and glacial lakes, which set the basis of climate change studies in Pakistan. So that made sensitization at a various lens. Then many organizations started working on climate change studies. Then we did a lot of studies on climate change impact on water sources as our cold region hydrology, glacier and water sources. But from last 9 to 10 years, we are now much focusing on climate change adaptation as well as mitigation, especially in natural sources as well as in agriculture. And we are now focusing on climate smart agriculture. As we know, climate smart agriculture, it has 3 pillars. One, it has a farmer's profitability, or you can say sustainable use of input, as well as the practices which mitigate the climate in terms of GHG emission. And those practices are those intervention or technologies by using them which minimize the emission of greenhouse gases emission, as well as in terms of adaptation, like in water sources. So our organization as well as institute have been working on many fronts. Again, I would say climate smart agriculture is a very broader field. It's not a single field. Agriculture has a lot of subsector, and climate change is a cross-cutting, and it involves every subsectors. So there are a huge number of intervention which we can say that those are climate smart. But in terms of water sources, as our countries arid environment, and our agriculture depends on the irrigation, and we do have a lot of vulnerability in terms of water availability as well as demand. So we are working on providing irrigation, improving irrigation efficiency. I'm sure everyone knows about drip irrigation, sprinkler irrigation, that is in business from last many years. But unfortunately, the adoption rate is not uh, satisfactory in Pakistan. So, in spite of a lot of government projects with the full subsidies or 80% of the subsidy, still we got the target of about 90,000 acres. And if we talk about the effectiveness, so out of 90,000 acres, there will only be 15 to 20,000 acre who are really using that drip irrigation. Otherwise, many of people have abandoned those systems, rolled those systems. Whereas India, at the same time, they started these high efficient irrigation systems like Pakistan. So we have the same climate, same environment, same soil, and same social fabrics. Uh, last until January 2023, so India has reached about 22 million hectares under drip and sprinkler irrigation system, whereas we have less than zero point 0.1 million. So there's a large difference in terms of they adopted better policies. So and they imported the technology and started manufacturing in their country. But whereas Pakistan, as in many other items, we preferred importing the technology, importing the product instead of the technology. So we made bomb and everything, but we could not make the simple drip or those kind of systems there. So,
Right. Doc-
I mean, drip and sprinkler is one of best technologies. So we need to upscale those area. And very recently, we are working on another technology, that is responsive drip irrigation technology. We have from the last 3 years, we have made its trial in various locations, like in Potwara region as well as in Cholastan, Tharparkar. That is very kind of highly innovative, I would say, magic technology. Uh, its water has about 40 to 50% water saving than the drip. 80 to 90% water saving than the conventional or flood irrigation, but 40 to 50% less water consumed than the drip. And its energy requirement is very less. It's a very low pressure system. It operates on a 2 psi, whereas our drip irrigation operates on 15 minimum 15 psi. And this in terms of energy saving, in terms of water saving, as well as in terms of more 10 to 15% more yield, as well as saving in fertilizer. We have its trial in various kind of agro-environmental condition, because here climate conditions are different than Tharparkar. And last Friday, we released that technology in Pakistan. So there was a big event over there. So we feel that being a professional, that technology, RDA technology, has a great blessing for Pakistan, especially in water scarce area in Balochistan. So the good part for the technology is highly equally useful. Can be used for crop, vegetable, as well as more with the fruits and other
Absolutely,
in
Dr.
terms of.
Rishi. Yeah, no, no, no. I would love for you to keep talking. I also want to keep ample time for question and answers. As in our last panel discussion, there were a lot of questions that were left unanswered. So, taking off from what you said, you're talking about a lot of water saving technology. You're talking about a lot of interventions that are taking place. But in order to make these interventions happen, or sort of like get this change to happen, we need a lot of, like, say, development organizations help, or the government's help, or policy sectors. And that's where I would like to address my question to Dr. Imran. What is the nexus between the development sector and academia in Pakistan, and how does this play into Pakistan's short-term crisis response and long-term strategy development?
Thank you, Amira. Thank you for having me be a part of this discussion at NUST. It's always wonderful to be back, especially because I did my master's here many, many years back. So I just want to pick up on Dr. Bashir because we're talking about partnerships. So WWF and NARC right now are in a discussion to develop a memoranda of understanding in terms of ensuring that some of the work that we are doing finds synergy. So there's a project under, it's called the Water Resources Accountability Program. We're working on it in Gilgit-Baltistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. And we've shared some of our understandings with NARC, and we're trying to learn from them and see where we can come together and move forward in this regard, because there's a lot of potential when it comes to development organizations, organizations who are working in the field across Pakistan. Um, Vis-a-vis academia, things are not too dissimilar. It's very important to recognize the importance of academia in environmental decision making, in decision making vis-a-vis climate change, because data is something that's going to be key, and it's not there, it's missing. uh, the way things are changing, we are at 1.2 degrees centigrade of warming. So what we used to understand and know as the normal has now been altered. So the growing seasons have changed. The availability of water is changing. How are the communities responding to it? What are their needs? What policy mechanisms need to be implemented in order to ensure that we are developing in a resilient manner, that we are developing sustainably, not just talking about the SDGs or whatever is written in the Paris Climate Agreement, but truly in a resilient manner, so the needs of the people and the communities who are suffering can be taken into account. And here, academia comes. The role of academia becomes very, very important. Pakistan has universities, in urban areas and in rural areas. So if you're in Dera Ghazi Khan, there are academic institutions there. My question is, are we going to them and putting forth our policy and decision-making criteria and saying, look, we need to understand whether you're working in this and how you can help us in developing policies that can help us address the flood crisis in the rivers, in the Rutkoi, for example. How are people moving? How are people getting displaced? Are people migrating? A lot of those things need to be brought to the fore. And here the academia can really play an important part. Similarly, we've got these centers of excellence that have come about with the help of the US government, for example. One of them is housed here at NUST, is the Center for Excellence in Energy. There's a Center of Excellence in Agriculture that's at Faisalabad. There's one at Jamshoro. Now here too, you've got these centers of excellence that can really help bring together communities, other experts and professionals who are working in this domain, and move forward so that we can take the policies as they're written. So we've got the climate policy, we've got the water policy, but what's the way ahead? And here, the synergy, to me, it's lacking. Yes, the glass is half full, but given the sort of crisis we are facing, I mean, look at the recent floods. We really need to move forward.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Imran. And you mentioned some data gaps. So, when it comes to climate change impacts, databases, historic and otherwise, are important in understanding what our future looks like. So, Dr. Salman, I'd like to ask you that academia plays a big role in filling up these research and data gaps. So, how can academia and development sector, and potentially other sectors as well, collaborate more effectively in building databases for Pakistan's climate crisis?
Thank you so much, Amira. Generally, academia is actually the source of knowledge, and most of the time, what we have seen is that academia plays a very significant role in ensuring creating that knowledge out of data available. Now, the question that arises then, where academia is going to get that data from? Most of the people who work in the academic sector have usually worked on their master's and PhD thesis, and they have been collectively exposed and introduced to various organizations and their databases on such data. So their knowledge regarding the possibility of availability of that data is there. And then there are those who have worked on developing data out of nothing as well, out of thin air, I would say. One very significant example of that is the Oak Ridge National Laboratory in the United States, which is a supercomputing facility which works with the Department of Defense and Energy, and which works on night light data from around the globe. Now, the institution decided to get satellite data of the amount of illumination that they would see from space at night in different sectors or different sections of the world. And then they decided to get data from census and statistical bureaus from around the world. And they decided to model that data into a global population census database, which for big cities we have found to be in some cases up to 90% in relevance with the published records. And that's where academia plays a very significant role, and how academia plays a significant role. Academia definitely is not the custodian of data sets. It would definitely not do that, but it would know how these data sets are produced and how these data sets can be brought together. For example, NUST is working on the National Spatial Data Infrastructure for Pakistan, NSTI. And it's already working on the feasibility report for the survey of Pakistan. And in a later stage, it will be actually bringing together all stakeholders, which are custodians of those data sets, and interfacing them with each other and bringing them together on the same table or platform where they could negotiate on how much they would buy that data for. Academicians are going to tell you something else about data as well, the sanctity of information, and I would not like to miss this opportunity to let you know about that. A majority of our students go for data, and they ask for data because they think that it's their general right to do so. A single POI on the international market for any place, if you really catalog it in the context of price, would cost, point of interest is like a petrol pump, a restaurant, a cafe, a school, would cost about $14 to any corporation if it would want to buy that kind of data. That's the market cost. So while academia can tell you how easy it is to get data, academia should also be telling you how prestigious data is and how much money there is that a nation can make out of data. We go on Facebook, Instagram, Google Maps, and we publish our experiences to that point even. And that's why we had a mapping bill, which probably has been misunderstood by many people, suggesting that people are being stopped from mapping. No, people are not being stopped from mapping. People are just being told that, rationalize it so that the state can actually make money out of such a big industry, which is cartography and map making and data, obviously. So this is altogether where academia plays a very significant role. And once data is there, as I mentioned, we create knowledge out of it. And then there are people who turn that into wisdom. And that is what contributes at large to the greater society.
So you've elaborated the importance and significance of data, and also like how much it costs in real time as well. Data is very important and we undervalue it. I would like to change gears a little bit and talk to Dr. Ilhan about his new book. So in your book, you've Downfall Lessons for Our Final Century. You argue that negative outcomes to the present crises are sort of unavoidable because they're too deeply rooted in our historical, psychological, and biological conditioning. Could you elaborate a little on this historical, psychological, and biological conditioning due to which we might now be more vulnerable to climate change today?
Right. Thank you for having me. I'll just focus on one aspect of it, which is pertinent to our discussion here about the role of academia in terms of what's going on. So academics and academia in general are often accused of existing in a kind of ivory tower. And that is a fair accusation, because the fact is that the essence of university life, essence of research, is about creating a kind of a bubble within which ideas and thought and creativity and other such things can flow perhaps more freely than they could outside that campus. But one of the things that history has to teach us is that policymakers, the generals and bureaucrats and captains of industry that actually make decisions, they actually have very little use in terms of their policy framework beyond rationalizing those things that they already wish to see happen uh, regarding what is being produced by academics. So let's, for instance, take the thing about climate change, because I deal with that extensively in my book. And one of the sad parts about the climate crisis is how predictable it has been. Since the 1960s, the basic mechanism that will bring it about has been understood. In 1972, in the landmark study by Meadows et al., The Limits to Growth, the trajectory of our industrial, capitalist, consumerist civilization leading into a mid 21st century crash has been creditably predicted and understood. Since the late 1980s, there has been a near perfect scientific consensus in terms of what is causing climate change and ecocide, and the policy prescriptions for dealing with it have been over there. But the problem is that our political and administrative and economic decision making structures are fundamentally characterized by excessive elitism. So you have an elite that is fundamentally insulated or likes to think it is insulated from the long term adverse consequences of its overconsumption and its hoarding. And then you have the added complication that in order to get anything done, you need a large amount of either administrative energy or social mobilization to achieve it. And people who are in positions of authority, vested interests, if you will, are in a very good position to disrupt and deflect and otherwise misdirect popular anxiety about what is going on. So we face a very interesting situation where literally it is now easier to envisage the end of the planet, the end of human civilization, than it is to imagine a world in which this business as usual does not continue. So I think that in that respect, academics should not perhaps overstate what we can do or what we can't do. History teaches us again and again that the wisest, most serious advice given in a timely manner to policymakers has been repeatedly rejected because, in the eyes of the policymakers, the short term requirement, the immediate requirement, winning the next election, preventing the next recession, trying to stave off social instability in the short term, avoiding inconvenience to the public that a serious response to climate change and ecocide would occasion. All of that is something that then effectively gets billed to the future. Now, the problem, of course, is that we have run out of future to keep sending the bill to. And I often feel very sorry when I see my own students at the Quaid-e-Azam University and when I see students elsewhere, that basically, your elders, your parents and your grandparents have in structural terms robbed you of the opportunity of living a peaceful, productive life in which you could have normal aspirations as they themselves once had. And all of this, of course, feeds into our inability, our psychological, our mental inability to process things that are of an abstract nature. So the same United States government that spent something like $6-7 trillion fighting terrorism in the first 2 decades of the 20th century spends about 150 billion US dollars fighting climate change. We all know that terrorism cannot destroy the United States. Climate change is actually destroying large parts of the United States as we speak. But what is the focus going on in the United States these days? They're shooting down weather balloons with, $500,000 missiles, and that is where all the focus, all the attention, everything is going. So I feel basically, and we can like debate this further, that in many ways, our basic mental, psychological conditioning and equipment is no longer capable of responding to the mess that we are in. That in many ways, our species has proven to be, too clever for its own good. And we have created processes of consumption and environmental destruction that, while producing temporary convenience for the few that are privileged, is producing long term consequences that we are simply unable to respond to. So if you think of humanity today, there is, of course, greater awareness about the situation that we are facing. But I think Goebbels' description of the French army in its conflict with the Germans is apt, that we are basically rabbits mesmerized by a snake. So on that point, I'll stop. Thank you.
Absolutely, Dr. Ilhan. And one thing that you mentioned about the US spending more money on terrorists to fight terrorism rather than climate change, even though climate change is destroying the US as we speak. But then again, when we see the statistics, the areas of the US that are more affected or like badly, let's say, injured, are the areas that are socially marginalized. And in that perspective, that is something that Ms. Mahin used to talk about in our climate change classes as well. But what is the way forward for in terms of Pakistan and the world? But how can Pakistani academia fit into the solution, especially in terms of social protection with regards to the impacts of climate change?
Sure. Thank you so much, Amira. And also, it sounds like a very interesting book, Professor Ilhan. By the math that I can do, it sounds like we have 77 years left. So, but I, definitely like to read it at some point. So, for everyone else who's around here, very nice to be back at NUST. And I should also mention that this is the first time I'm seeing Amira in person. So she was in, the COVID batch of students that I had. And so it's a pleasure meeting you in person. Now, the reason I mentioned COVID is because it was a covariate shock for us, right? And we were not prepared. As I had never used Teams before that. We had not recorded our lectures online before that. So there's a lot that we had to do in terms of preparation in the real time. And then in terms of coping, we were able to cope as we went along. And then we adapted as well. And there's a lot of things that have continued since the adaptations that we made. We have days where, the roads are blocked and we then take our classes, or you or any student who's around here, you take your classes online. So we adapted to a shock, maybe more so in real time and not really ahead of time, but that's all right. Now, when we talk about COVID as a covariate shock, and then we move on to climate change, that is also a covariate shock, right? The only thing that I perceived to be different about COVID was how close it was to a lot of us in this room, right? None of us, or I shouldn't assume, but I would say a lot of us have had the privilege of maybe not being directly affected by the floods that occurred. But in the longer run, or in, the future, we may be affected one way or another by any of these other covariate shocks as a result of climate change. How prepared are we? That's a question that remains to be seen. Are we ready to cope? And do we have the ability to adapt? And do we have the ability to build resilient communities? And as a social protection practitioner, as a social protection specialist, that's something that I think about a lot right now, right? So I think about adaptive social protection, specifically climate adaptive social protection. What can we do in the development sector? And how can we actually align with the academic sector as well? I used to say this a lot in my classes, and now that I'm somewhat on the other side, I feel it as well. I really don't have the time as someone who has the ability influence policy directly, to maybe have a look at all the studies that are being published, or to remain up to date with what's the latest, let's say, conversation, or what the latest items are being researched in academia. And how do we bridge that gap then? Now, when I present certain solutions to the policymakers, they too don't have the time. Now, the question then is, I don't have an answer, and I'm going to, prefer not to prescribe any solution because I honestly don't have any. But there are tools, and I'm sure, the colleagues who are here on this panel, you would be better equipped or with the knowledge about those tools. Things like systematic literature reviews, those can be very, very helpful for us. And if we're talking about climate adaptive social protection, I would love to know, let's say, what risks are being faced by certain communities who are, let's say, closer to the rivers, or who are more at risk of suffering from these covariate shocks in the future, so that when this happens, and one thing with that I noticed as a side note when I started looking into adaptive social protection was, the initial shock to my own system. Does this mean that, we're done trying to prevent climate change? And it seemed a bit morbid, but I see now, as I've started continued learning about it even more, so how necessary it is that we build those systems in place. We know that, if we're talking about awareness, for instance, awareness raising for potential beneficiaries affected by covariate shocks, we won't be able to reach them when, let's say, they don't have access to television anymore in floods, or if they don't have access to the telephone lines anymore. We can really benefit from the academia on ideas, or on research, or on what works best in other areas. And something that Dr. Bashir also mentioned, which I find really interesting, is the point about us importing the product and not the technology. And I can even extend that to a lot of other things, such as, us importing sometimes policies without necessarily the rationale, or without necessarily having a look at the evidence base, which is in our context, and having a look at what works. I think those are all avenues where we could really benefit. And then other things, such as, how do we communicate the research product that you are producing? It's very rich research product, and especially because it's for here, right? I used to also supervise a couple of research theses, and the ideas that were flowing from there were absolutely important. But how do we bring that to the practitioners, or how do we bring that to the sector that I now work in? I'm sorry, I don't really have any answer, but it's just a few more questions for us to maybe consider. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for that insight, actually. And you're right about the quality of research that we have in terms of technology at NUST, especially, which is some of which is displayed outside as well. One thing, like, I'm not very well versed, but one thing that I find really interesting out of the projects is the CO2 bin that was developed by the students of Dr. Fahim Poker. And I'm not sure, don't quote me on this, but they're using recycled lithium batteries to sort of like pull out the carbon dioxide from the air, and have a clean sort of output. So it's technology like this which makes me think, why aren't we, sort of investing in this, and sort of like promoting this, and how can we bring this to the forefront? But that being said, I want to remind you all that this is a discussion-based platform, so feel free to comment on the other panelists' views and stuff. And also, after the last panel, a lot of people were left unanswered with questions. So I do want to open the audience to questions. If they have any, they can join in the discussion, and maybe we can continue the discussion in that way. So if anyone has any questions, please raise your hands as well. In the meantime, I would like to ask all of you, what are some of the gaps that you can identify when it comes to talking about climate change in Pakistani academia, and what particular direction would you like to see NUST go into as we try to take an interdisciplinary approach to climate change, and we try to, formulate a sort of platform where we can bring together academia in Pakistan to work on climate action collectively for the benefit of our nation. So what is it that you would like to see academia be doing in the future in terms of Pakistan's benefit? Anyone can take the question if you want. Yes.
Well, let me bring to everyone's knowledge that one of our project from SADA, which I think Dr. Fawad, Sir Fawad did there, was shortlisted for as a carbon arrestor technology for vehicles that are on the move. So they had this particular kind of rooftop designed for cars, which if it would exceed, it would be driving at a certain low speed, that car would be automatically capturing back carbon emissions from the car in front of it and then filtering it out of the air. So that's one technology, and that was actually internationally acclaimed and shortlisted among the top 10 technologies for that year. Uh, at that particular event, I do not remember the exact name of the event, but it was an interesting idea that really was appreciated globally. Other than that, when we're talking about research at NUST or kind of approaches that we need to have at NUST, I believe that in a majority of cases, and since I like write and publish on the topic as well, it has the reality has not struck yet, and that's very concerning. For a majority of us, we still associate a lot of events with conspiracy theories, and we do question the reality of certain happenings, which we as academicians and students should not do at all. One of the reasons for that is that while we might not be there to experience the wrath of climate change, the generation that's sitting in front of us, or the generation that is being raised in your houses, in our houses, is going to face it, and will have to stand right uh, in front of it. And as a matter of fact, that's where it's going to be getting very serious. While United States and China would not worry too much because they have got excessive resources, control, and technological development to answer those challenges with for. So, I mean, even if it was COVID, China could contain it within its border, and China did not get economically as affected as the rest of the world did. United States again has the resources to do so. It can stop a single seed from entering its border if it needs to do so. We are the countries, the developing nations and economies which are going to be the most affected. And that's where it gets rather more concerning. In addition to that, most of the curricula that we had, I think the first time that I really came face to face with the inclusion of topics on climate change and weather and deforestation in school curricula was in the year 2004, when the Aga Khan University decided to develop the first ever private examination board in the country. Before that, we did not have any control on it. And that was the time when the Higher Education Commission was actually getting some footing. And at the UGC, we did not have these national curriculum review committees that we have today, which could incorporate climate change related education properly into the system as such. So what I would rather say is that we are actually very late into it already. In addition to that, in most of the academia that we have today, teaching related education is missing. So we've been explicitly teaching something and implicitly including that knowledge. While most of the maths that we teach, while most of the statistics that we teach, while most of the English and Urdu literature that we teach can somehow include information or events or knowledge related to climate change and the kind of adverse effect it could have. And then in addition to that, we do see certain community projects that are being done around the world to raise awareness regarding climate change. I really can refer to one that was done in Bangladesh, where students decided to actually use water bottles from these cola companies or other plastic bottles and funnel air into a thinner channel and reduce indoor temperature up to down up to. So they would actually they would take a cardboard and then they would mount these bottles on them and they would funnel air into them, so the outer larger opening and there will be the smaller inside opening of the bottle towards the inside of the window, and they were experiencing 1 to 2 degree Celsius of reduction of temperature. It was not really practical in high temperature areas, on the places where temperatures were less than 35 degrees Celsius. Yeah, you need wind for that as well. But since most of Bangladesh is coastal or estuarine, so for them it was quite practical to do that. In our case, obviously, in some places around Karachi, it could be the reason, but not more than that. So, I mean, that's sort of things that need to come into the limelight. I don't know. There are many of us would probably not look into climate change, but look into our policy in that regard. We will look into other things. An unfortunate aspect of our academia is at the same time that most of the people who study sociology, international relations, mass communication, tend to not get into the business really. Some, like I mean, a vast majority of those people do it for getting a postgraduate degree. So that's where there has to be an initiative, and those degrees need to be valued far more than they are valued at this time in our society.
Amira, if I may add. So look, let's be very clear as to what is happening. The greenhouse gas emissions are not going to stop. We've had 27 conference of parties, failure after failure. We're at 1.26 degrees of warming. We are going to be at 2.6 by the end of the century. That's according to the latest emissions gap report, which talks about whether or not we are in line with the Paris Climate Agreement. No, we are not. Now, where does that put countries like Pakistan? Are we going to talk about mitigation? Are we going to talk about loss and damage? Are we going to talk about adaptation? That's a question for us. Mitigation is important, but at this time, whether or not Pakistan mitigates, it's not going to make a difference. It's because we're not large emitters. Our emissions at this time are less than 1%. They're 1%, and there are many other countries who are contributing 1%, and that all adds up. And it's important that we move away from coal and move towards solar. But what is really needed right now are adaptation mechanisms to be in place in order to address the climate crisis. We need to have governance structures that speak to the climate crisis. We need to understand that the floods that happen right now may have begun or may have been induced by the climate crisis, but the losses are largely a result of our governance failures. So what does that leave us? That kind of goes to show that we're working in silos. Institutions such as NUST, are we partnering with other universities who are less well off? I mean, we're sitting in a wonderful auditorium, right? How many of the students from NUST are researching water issues and heat waves in Dhok Hassu, which is not very far from here, or the French colony for that matter, or in Rawat, right? There are real stakes for people on the ground. There are people lining up for wheat. Our economy is in doldrums, and this requires a concerted effort in terms of addressing the real life situation. Whether or not we're going to be able to do that, that is still a question mark. But what needs to be done right now is to, get out from our the surroundings that we are in. These are quite elitist. We're all part of that. we are not going to be affected by the climate crisis. And we really need to speak to those compatriots, those elements in our country who are being affected most by it. Whether or not we can do that, that's a question mark. That's something for us to address. That's something for us to highlight. There needs to be, so what needs to start to happen? We need to stop thinking about climate change as something that only climate scientists need to address. Climate change is going to be something that needs to be picked up by everyone. So I really appreciated the fact that Dr. Ilan was able to write this book, and I went through it very quickly. And I agree with his sentiment that we don't have much time. And in fact, we've run out of it. And it's primarily due to the fact that we are working in silos. We talk about working in silos, but we do that. One of the things that academia does is this publish or perish culture, whereby you're trying to publish something and you want to get ahead. If you want to get move up from an assistant professor to an associate professor, you have to publish. You have to do some things that are truly on your own plate and that can be ticked off. Unfortunately, that allows very little room for collaboration. There should be room for collaboration, but it's not there. Similarly, university rankings, that's where HSC should come in. Here, everyone is trying to focus on their own set of goals. So there are 6 or 7 universities in Islamabad. I would like you to tell me to what extent are they collaborating when it comes to understanding the water issues in the city. We talk about the water mafia in Karachi. There are water problems in the city right now. How about heat waves? How about waste? Right? How about deforestation? How about the impact on the Margala Hills National Forest? So collaboration is easier said than done. We have to get out of our rooms. We have to get out of our offices. I think this is a good start. But I'm very pessimistic as to whether we can do this. So that's what we should be targeting.
Absolutely, sir. Sir, you would like to add something? So would you like to add something?
Yeah, sorry. Thank you very much. I think a good start. But I agree with Dr. Khalid. But unfortunately, there have been many institutions, many organizations, as well as many universities. They have started working on climate change. But to be unfortunately, most of the universities, as most of the institution like our nation, have been a lot of talking. We are working in our convenience. So to us, many students from various universities come to NARC, and most of the students, they are in a hurry. And they expect us, give us the data, and they will use the model, garbage in, garbage out, and very quickly get the degrees, as well as get some publication, impact publication. But universities, I would say, should be the source of inspiration for technological development, for climate actions, for the solutions. But unfortunately, I would say more than 90% of the universities, as well as the institution we are talking about, ड्राई रहे हैं जी. हमें सबको पता है यार, क्लाइमेट चेंज हो रही है, इतनी डिग्री हो रही है, इससे पाकिस्तान से ज्यादा और कितना विटनेस हुआ है. डराने से काम नहीं चलेगा, कुछ एक्शन पे भी काम करना पड़ेगा. सो अनफॉर्चुनेटली universities, as well as many institutions, working on that one. So only few people, few institutions, they are really focusing on climate action, developing technologies, and talking about the mitigation as well as adaptation. Yes, I think NUST can take a lead. It's mostly technological university, so focusing on technological development as well as solution for the adaptation and mitigation. Otherwise, we will be talking, frightening the people on the climate change, its impacts. So only by talking we cannot survive ourselves. We need focus on solution, as well as more on development work in terms of mitigation and development. adaptation.
Absolutely, sir. Thank you so much for your thoughts. And we're running short on time, but Ms. Maham has been waiting a while to ask a question, so we'll just take one question.
Thank you so much. The questions, I just have two questions to ask to the panel. I believe the sensitization is very important for this climate action. Because when I came here, I was not aware of the SDGs, and like me, most of the students might have not have been aware of most of the work that we are doing. So how do you think it is important to create a sensitization of this particular topic in our younger generation? And do you think that the training part, जो हम करते हैं कि we need to keep repeating it until it's done? So do you think the repeating part would help in this regard? Secondly, I would like to ask our panel speaker who is from NARC, sir. NARC is working on a numerous corporate collaborations that I have known. So do you think that they are creating an impact in regard for the climate action? क्योंकि NRC काफी corporate organizations के साथ भी काम कर रहा होता है, तो क्या आपको लगता है कि वो एक impact create कर रहे हैं initially कि जो एक चाहिए होता है? Thank you.
जी थैंक यू वेरी मच। मेरे ख्याल है कि मैंने जिस तरह शुरू की थी, वी आर द पायनियर वर्किंग जो क्लाइमेट चेंज, मेरे ख्याल है कि मोस्ट ऑफ द जनरेशन उस वक्त इधर बैठे भी नहीं जब से हम इस पे काम कर रहे हैं। तो आर वर्क मेड अ पाथवे फॉर सेंसिटाइजेशन इसके लिहाज से, क्लाइमेट चेंज के लिहाज से। बट जिस तरह मैंने पहले कहा कि अनफॉर्चुनेटली पिछला 1 या 1.5 डिकेड हम लोग इसी डराने पे लगे हुए हैं, क्लाइमेट चेंज उसके इम्पैक्ट्स इस तरह के आ रहे हैं। जो वर्किंग इन टर्म्स ऑफ होनी चाहिए थी सोल्यूशन डेवलपमेंट पे वो बहुत कम है। यस, वी आर वर्किंग ऑन दैट वन एज आई टॉक अबाउट फ्यू थिंग्स, बट वी हैव अ लॉट ऑफ solution, working on the solution in terms of regenerative agriculture, in terms of जो हमारे स्वाक के इश्यूज आ रहे हैं उसके लिहाज से, जो राइस वीट सिस्टम में किस तरह कंट्रीब्यूट कर रही है मशीनरी डेवलप करने के लिए, कि जो आपके स्टबल्स हैं